Welcome to another Django for Everybody code walkthrough. In this, I am going to walk through the Hello World application that you've got to do. This is the DIY part of the course where we've been developing an application for a while, and you've been modifying an existing application, local library, and its catalog, local library project catalog application. And it's time for you to start fresh, and I want you to really understand what's going on. So I'm going to go through in some great detail. So this tells you how to get started, and we're going to assume that you're running on your local computer. If you're still running Python anywhere, that's okay. I've got another video for that. So somewhere you've got a folder called Django Projects, and so I've got my folder in, this is a Macintosh, and I've done all of the installation. I sort of followed this installation. Now the weird thing is there's so many different ways that you can install Python 3 and Django on your computer. You might use Anaconda or Miniconda or pip or whatever. And so I haven't given you like every single possible version of how you might do that. You have to kind of figure a bit of that out on your own. I've been giving you some online resources. But hopefully, when it's all said and done, whether you've done a virtual environment or not, you have things like Python 3 running, and you have Django, minus M Django, Python 3 minus M Django version, and you can look at what is your current pip. In mine, all my extensions. You might not even be using pip for your extensions, but if I say pip freeze, I use pip 3 to install them. Yeah, I see all the versions of all my extensions, and if I look through here, for example, I can find Django extensions, and that means that I have Django extensions. And some of the problems that people have are like when they don't have the right extensions installed. So here I am in Django Projects, and if I do an ls, you see all the projects that I've got. I've got the local library and my test site. Those are from before. This is, DJ Free is the one you're going to work on, but you're going to work on that and add stuff to it, and so that's a later version of it. I made another one that's just this first Hello World, so I can take a look at it, and I named it first. And so you would do a Django admin start project DJ Free, but I did a Django admin start project first, and that's just the name of it. And then I went into that folder, and so I'm going into the first folder, first. And then I did a Python 3 manage py start app home. And so this shows that I've got a home folder, then this first folder, which is the project-wide settings.py and project-wide urls.py, and of course the db.sqlite3. Now, at this point, when you're in this folder and you've got these things set up, it might not hurt to do a Python 3 manage.py shell, because if this doesn't work, then you've got some configuration wrong. So the fact that this worked and didn't blow up with a big traceback, that suggests that I've got all the right stuff installed, and it's good. So I just have to Control D to get out of here. So there we go. That's a funny looking shell prompt, but that's how it is on my Macintosh. So that's weird. Your Linux boxes and maybe your Windows boxes look a lot prettier than that. But the point is, if you can't run Python 3 manage py shell, make migrations isn't going to work, etc., because this manage.py loads up everything. It loads up all of your applications and all the urls.py and all the views.py. And so you think, oh, just start a shell. Well, no, this is completely construct the Django application and then start a shell in that Django application. So if there's anything wrong with any of your files, well, you go, now ignore this little part right here. The .quit didn't work. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the files that matter. So the first thing is that the folder that is the same name as the project folder, and my project folder is first. There is first/settings.py. And if you take a look, it tells you what to do here. A couple things I'll call your attention to. So leave debug true. Do not set debug to be false, even though the comment right above it will encourage you to do it. What it really is doing is telling it whether or not to give verbose error messages. When debug is true, the error messages are verbose. When debug is false, the error messages are cryptic. Well, you're writing software. You need all the help you can get when you make a mistake. You want verbose error messages. So debug equals true means verbose equals yes. Allowed host, this is one we've had to do every time we make one, where we basically, that is the addresses from the internet that are allowed to access this application. And then start project sets this up, and then you have to add a home config, your home apps home config. And so that is the setup to get your home application loaded. And if you take a look at first/urls.py, and by now, if you've done stuff in local library, your URLs are pretty complex. We've got pretty simple stuff. We're just going to include at the base URL all the home URLs, and then we're going to bring the admin in because we're going to need that later. So that is the urls.py. So that is the first things, and there needs to be a, in your home folder, urls.py, you have to create this file, but I give you the exact text of this file. And we're going to use a template view, and we're just going to have a template name. Remember that templates are global, and so we kind of re-add the, I just dragged that, I undid it. We add the home/hello.html in a way to kind of create a global namespace of templates. And so that's your urls.py, and I completely give that to you. And then the last thing that you're going to edit is the home/templates home. Again, you have to do this twice. Hello.html, and against this last part, home/hello.html matches the templates in the urls.py, and you just put HTML in here. And I just happen to put an h1 hello world. Now, if we are sitting here and we've got these things all correct, we just say python3 manage.py run server. Now, this is going to connect to my local host 8000, 127.0.0.1/:8000. That's port 8000. And if you've got one of these running in a different window, it will say the port is already busy, but you're jacking into the port. If you go all the way back, we talked about the request response cycle and servers. You should remember about ports and how servers grab onto ports so they can listen for phone calls. So we are going to go into localhost 8000. Actually, just go on 27, doesn't matter. And so that retrieves our page. Now this shows a couple of cool things, you know, because it showed the get. And so one of the nice things is you can watch things as they go on, and you see traceback errors and everything. And so I really like developing locally whenever I can, because I can really quickly switch from one application to another. So let me show you how I will switch from one application to the other. I'm going to hit Control-C to blow this up. So now there is no server. And if I go to this, it's going to say, sorry, I can't get that. And now I'm going to say cd ... I'm in my Django projects, and I've got a whole bunch of things. Let's go up one even more. And I've got DJ Freeze samples. So I've got this checked out. And there's a manage.py here. And I can say python3 manage py run server from this folder, which then runs that application. And now I can go to that exact same address, and I have a completely different application running on it. So this, and I can see the errors and favicons. This one actually has a favicon, I think. I don't know why the favicon didn't. Oh, maybe it doesn't do it for localhost. And so this ability to move around really quickly and start and stop servers in your Django application, and the ability to watch this stuff as it's running, is a real important part of why you'd run a local server if possible. And of course, I gave you a installing Django locally that does its best, because each thing is going to be a little bit different, and away you go. Okay, so in general, this is how my Hello World application is structured. There's really only 4 files that you need to edit and get right, and then you have to mostly the hard part for local running is getting your installation all done. So I hope this helps. Cheers. Hello and welcome to our tutorial on the Hello World application for Django for Everybody. So I am going to go in excruciating detail how I have this hello world, how this comes out at drchuck.pythonanywhere.com. And now, if you go to this website, you never know what you're going to see, because I have lots of Django projects that I can mount up on this URL, and I'll show you how that's all done. So, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to wake up my Python, just my Python for Everywhere, Python Anywhere dashboard, and walk through a couple of things. So I want to call your attention here to my left-hand side here. So you see that I've got a bash console and a bash console in the virtual environment Django 2. It's probably a good time to review what a virtual environment is. If you go back to your old installing Django on Python Anywhere, I have this assignment, and if you go back to this assignment, that's PAW_install_MD under the ASSN folder, you had this thing, make virtual environment, pip3 install Django, and then work on Django, and then we would do Python 3 -m Django -- version. And at some point it showed you the Django version. And if you recall, this took some bit of a long time. And virtual environments are a way in Python for you to change the overall Python configuration and install things that the owner of this computer has not installed themselves. So, so Python Anywhere, they installed a version of Python, they may have installed Django, they may or may not have installed Django extensions, etc. And so you want to have more control over what bits of software are actually running in your environment. So instead of using a system-wide Python, you're going to use your own environment, and that's what a virtual environment is. And so this is creating files in your home directory, and if you go in under Files. So I'll go in under the Files tab of Python Anywhere. If you see it in your home directory, you see .virtualenv, and if you go in, you see one folder called Django 2. And that actually has lots of stuff. You don't want to include, you don't want to mess with this. That virtual env Django 2, .virtualenvs Django 2, that was created by you when you ran make virtual environment, and it downloaded a bunch of stuff. And then in that, you could run the pip3 command, which is installing extensions to Python. Now, on your laptop, you might be able to just run pip3 normally, and just install more stuff once you have it configured properly. But now we're on a shared system at Python Anywhere, so we have to do virtual environments. You can do virtual environments in your laptop as well. It's nice if you do it, but it's not essential. Sometimes you can just run pip yourself and have the system-wide Python get all your stuff. But sometimes your laptop can get messed up because systems like Anaconda or Miniconda really confuse your Python, and that's unfortunately because there are so many ways to install and reconfigure Python on your laptop that can get you in trouble. But in this Linux arrangement that we have with Python Anywhere, it's actually pretty easy. You make a virtual environment, it works pretty good. Now, every time you leave and make a new shell, you have to say work on Django 2, otherwise you've inherited the standard things. And so if I take a look at my dashboard, and you see I've got a bash console, and then I've got a bash console in the virtual environment named Django 2. And so if I click on the bash console alone, you see I don't have the work on the Django 2 prompt. That should be a sign that something's not going to work for you. And what you can do is you can always just say work on Django 2. And that says for the rest of this session, until that bash console goes away, I want to be using the Python that is part of my virtual environment. Now there's a command in Linux called which. So I'm going to say which Python. Well, now it might actually, this one might python3. So you'll see which tells me if I type the command python3, which python3 says, if I type the command python3, where's it going to load that code from? And you see that which python3 is going from the virtual environment, meaning I have installed a copy of Python3 in my home directory, and that's the one I'm using when I type Python3. And that's the essence of how this virtual environment works. So I'm going to log out of this shell. Okay, exit. We'll just exit. Okay, so now if I go back to the dashboard, I should only So I have this one here. I'm not going to click on the bash console in virtualenv yet. I'm just going to start a new console, and that'll start one up, and I won't be in the virtual environment. So that's the key. Every time you start a new one, you see I'm not in the virtual environment because it doesn't say Django. If I type which Python 3, that is my own local copy of Python 3, and I don't quite know how that works, but it's not the system one, but I'm going to guess that is not one that's in my virtual environment. But there's other parts that of the virtual environment that are important. So that just shows you that. I'm going to exit out of here using Control D, and that's going to close this. Now I can go back to my dashboard. Now, there's a really cool thing that you can do to make sure you're always in a virtual environment, and I do this all the time almost without thinking. So I'm going to go under my Web tab in Python Anywhere, and if you scroll down, one of the things you were supposed to set up is this virtualenv area, and I've got that path, the exact home drchuck.virtualenvs Django 2. That's got to be in there, or my online web application is not going to run and start. Okay, but I can also then start a console in that virtual environment, and that's how I created that console. And if I click on this, start a console in the virtual environment, it actually starts it and then does the work on for me automatically, and you see that I've got Django 2 here automatically. And so that means that sort of all my Python Anywhere stuff works. You'll notice I'm actually properly in the folder for my Django project, and that Django project is the one that's currently mounted into my, I'm going to exit out of here, and so close this, go back to the Web tab, and so back to the Web tab, there are these variables, source code, working directory, WSGI configuration file. Those are telling the Python Anywhere which of the Django projects am I really mounting at this point. And we'll talk about these later. These three files allow me to have in my home directory on Python Anywhere a whole bunch of different projects and let me switch between them. The local library project, the Hello project, the DJ Free project, the my setup. And so this is how you switch it. Of course, whenever you switch these things, you've got to do the reload, right? So that's sort of my summary of virtual environments. And so I would say, ultimately, don't try to reinstall your virtual environments, right? I would install it once, and chances are good, if you did it right, your virtual environment is not broken. What is most likely broken is the fact that you're not using the virtual environment. So a lot of people are like, oh, I'm going to blast this virtual environment, trash it, and try to go all the way back to the install. Sometimes you might have to do that, right? But it kind of confuses your system if you are like running in the virtual environment and you wipe out the virtual environment, you try to remake the virtual environment, and it doesn't work so well. So just in general, once you get the virtual environment set up, leave it alone. Don't try to fix it. It's probably okay. Start a shell, say work on Django 2, and if it doesn't blow up, you're probably okay. Okay, so that's a quick review of what we have with virtual environments. And remember, this is PAW_install MD is the place where we set that up. But at this point, it's some time ago. Okay? So now that we've done all this, I'm going to go into my Web tab, and from previous times I've got this virtual environment. When you switch applications or switch Django projects, you don't switch the virtual environment. That stays the same. That's just giving you Django and Python and all the Python extensions, the Django extensions that we've added. So I'm going to go ahead and start a console. Hopefully I'm not running out of them. I keep exiting them so I don't run out of them. So I'm happy at the point where I've got a bash console and it's in the right folder and it's working in the Django 2 virtual environment. So you see that. I'm working in the Django 2 virtual environment. I'm in /Django_project/first. Now, I'm going to say cd ... to go up a folder. And so this folder is Django projects. If you're using GitHub, this is what you check into GitHub. And so this has all the work I've done so far in this course. I've got my test site, which was the very first assignment, then local library, which was all those whole series of assignments where we're making books and authors and all that stuff, and that code's all sitting here in local library. My folder's called Django projects because each one of these is a different Django project. Checklist is something we're going to build later. DJ Free is what you're building, hopefully, about right now. But I didn't name it because I had this thing called first, which is, I should probably call this the beginning. But first is this application that you're building from scratch at this point in this kind of DIY Hello World. So first, I made first by using a Django admin start app, and let's go to that, the Hello World page. Hello World. So, right, Django admin start projects DJ for E. That's going to make a subfolder within Django projects. You got to say work on Django 2 if you need it. But if Django 2 is already showing in your prompt, and you don't have to keep saying that over and over again. And then you're going to start an application within that. So I've gone down one folder into till Django projects DJ for E. I ran Python 3 manage.py start app home. And so if I take a look at the folders, I've got database, I've got first folder, which is the name for the Django project. That's where settings.py and urls.py for the entire project. And then I have one application called home, and we'll talk about that in a second. And that is the sort of first application. And home is actually where the template that renders Hello World is going to be shown. And so that's all good. And so I'm in project first, and I've done this other than I didn't name it DJ for E, I named it project first. Okay, now I say how to start Django new project if you're on a local computer. You're not on a local computer, you are in Python anywhere. So let's take a look at some of the files and the important things. And again, the instructions tell you how to edit these files. Or let's just file the outline of the homework assignment. So let's go into, I'm going to open this in a new window, the Web tab. Now, the Web tab is really cool. There's a reload, although you'll see that there's little reload buttons all over the place. If there's a little reload, there's not one here. I wish there was in the console, but there isn't. But reloading it is when you make changes, okay? So the key thing here is this code section. And there's source code, working directory, WSGI configuration file. Again, I said don't change virtual envs. And then there's this error log down here under log files, Dr. Chuck Python Anywhere.com error log. If you get the dreaded something went wrong with a smiley face, then you have to go look in this error log and scroll all the way to the bottom. But back to code and source code. So the working directory and source code are two of the three things you have to switch when you're going from one project to the other. And that is just the full path of the source code directory and the working directory. Working directory tells it how to find the db.sqlite file, right? So that is the file. And there's going to be many db.sqlite files under Django projects, one for each of the Django projects that I build. And that's where migrations, and so in every folder under Django projects, there is, here, let me go, cd ... I'm going to say ls-l star, that means in all folders, /db.sqlite3. And you see that there are a number of db.sqlite3s. And so it's important in the web app setup, I'll go back into first, cd first. It's important in the web app setup that you tell it where to go to get the db.sqlite3 file. You just edit this and you change it. Now, pretty much all this is the same, except the last part where it says first, and then you're going to change that. Now, you'll notice the path to the WSGI configuration file is not in your home folder at all. And so you just have to edit this. This is kind of in the system far, far outside your control, but it is the way that you tell the Django starter upper code that's part of Python Anywhere how to start your code up. And so here you generally have to get this path right, the OS path expand user tilde, which is my home directory, /Django project /first. That basically is the path to the Django project. And then you have to say first.settings. That has to do with the fact that this is the first module gets imported, and that's a object within the first module rather than a file path. So that's not really a file path, that is a module. Whereas that is a file path. And so you can switch back and forth, right? You can switch back and forth between many projects by changing those. There's two things you got to change here. You don't have to retype all this. You just change those two things. The word first, maybe it's local library, maybe it's my test app, Who knows? But it's a way you change it. And then you go back to Web tab, you change that file, the WSGI configuration file, and then you change the source code and you change the working directory, leave virtual environments alone, and then reload your application, and then you should see your application. Finish reloading, and here we are, drchuck.pythonanywhere.com, hello world. So I've showed you how Python Anywhere and virtual environments work, which is sort of like the outer wrapping of your application. And now I'll just sort of show your application. Now, this all is described in the section under djfree_hello.md. Change the source code, change the, your virtual environment should already be pointing, right? And then you gotta, I tell you to change these things, your name is not first, right? So your DJ, everything, or I'm using first, you're using DJ Free. And then I tell you to make some folders. So home is the first application. Underneath it, you're gonna put more in here. So you got to make the folder for templates, and folder for templates and templates home. The command to do that. So I'm in first, make dir home/templates. This is going to fail because it's already there. Yay! And then you got to add it again. Home templates home. Got to make that folder. So that you've got to do. I'll change that to put those instructions in. And then you got to create the file. Come back. Home/templates/home. So you got to put some HTML in. I'm going to put it in hello.html, and I say hello world. That's it. So I've got it. Okay, so I'm in hello world. Now you may have to put some more stuff in here, but that is the text that is this. Now, let's talk about how it all gets to work. Now, you've got to change the settings file, and in yours will be DJ Free. Mine is first settings.py. I'm going to edit that. So there's a few things to look at here in this file. Oops. So some mistakes I've seen students do is this debug, you want it true. They're telling you to turn it to false if you're in production, but you're not really in production. You're writing your code. When you're developing, you want debug turned on, and that has to do with the fact that it gives you more detail when you make errors. Otherwise, it's very cryptic about your detail. So a lot of students will come in, I can't figure out what's wrong with my thing because it just says error. Well, that's because you have debug to false. Now, reading this comment, it's really quite reasonable, so I just remind you over and over, do not set it to false, otherwise you will have great difficulty dealing with your application. You have allowed hosts, which basically says who can hit this application, and you want basically anybody, that's anybody on the internet to hit it. Okay, so we have the apps here that we want, and so those are the things that you've got to do. Get debug right, get allowed host right, and get the apps right. Okay? So that's that file. Then you've got to edit the file first, or DJ Free in your case, urls.py. And this, you'll put the admin and the home URLs so that you can eventually do the admin. The admin is less important in this particular first application, but you're going to need it soon enough, so we might as well just put it in. And then include the URLs from the home application within the first project. Okay, and then if we take a look in the home folder, pi home/urls.py, so here I just am going to import a template view, and then I'm going to basically route slash, so it's basically routing. The global URL routes the no path into, come back, global URL routes no path. There's like nothing here, right? There's nothing blah blah blah, there's nothing after it, right? Slash this. So it's like there's nothing on the URL. That gets routed into home.urls, and then I'm routing nothing within home.urls into just the template home/hello.html, and I'm giving it a name for no particular reason. Okay, and so those files, the first settings.py, the first URLs py, home URLs.py, and the home templates home hello.html, those are the files that you've got to create. And then you go to your web tab and you make sure that your code section has pointing to the right folder, both source code and working directory. Your WSGI configuration has been edited to point to the right folder, and then load up the project-wide settings. And then I think I can hit back here, yeah. And then make sure your virtual environment is right. Don't keep changing this, okay? And at that point, you should be able to reload your application. Visit your URL, and it should talk. And if it fails, if you don't get that and it sends the little funky message, well, let's just do this. Let's just cause the message. So I'm going to come in here in this WSGI configuration file, and I'm going to mess it up. Okay, and I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to go back to the web tab, and then I'm going to reload it. And if this goes well, something went wrong. Now everyone looks at this and they go like, oh, let's run and get help. It's telling you what to do. You look here in this error log first. I'm going to open it in a new window, Dr. Chuck, pythonanywhere.com error log, and then scroll all the way to the bottom. Now the weird thing here is all of your errors that you've done, right, are in here. So you got to get all the way down, right? And you got to look at the bottom, and you can even look at the times of these things. And it's a traceback, so just like in any Python, there's a lot of stuff that has nothing to do with you. But look at this one. Module not found error. No module named XYZZY. Error running WSGI application, right? And, you know, I just forced an error, right? And sometimes you can look in the server log to see it. If there's nothing that seems like it might be a suspect, you can check the server log. But the error log is mostly where you do this. So let me go fix that now. I made a mistake here, and I've got to change this to be first, XYZZY to first in the WSGI configuration, and then first again in the WSGI configuration, and then I save the file. Then I reload the application. This is up here in the file editing. I reload the application, and if all goes well, I should be able to reload it. So I hope this was helpful. It's a bit long. I wanted to just remind you of a whole bunch of things that can cause your application to go wrong. Part of the reason we're doing all this is so that your application can go right, but you've been working on the same application, and I want to get you focused on what it takes to build a new application and get that application running. Cheers. So now I want to talk about a concept called virtual hosting. Like I said, this doesn't really affect you directly, but I want to sort of show you a little bit about how an organization like Python Anywhere can have a very small amount of resources and support a very large number of hosts. And this is the idea that they have one piece of hardware or very few pieces of hardware and many different domains running on that system. And this also kind of helps you understand why you have to configure Python Anywhere the way you do to help them route the request not just to the server but to your application within the server where your application is running. So if you recall with the request response cycle, HTTP, it makes a connection to a domain and then it sends a GET request with the domain in the GET request. And so here we have the little sample. We say telnetdata.pr4e.org, that's the host, and port 80, which is to say let's talk to the web server, and then we connect and then we send the GET request. And the GET request has a couple of pieces, right? The GET request has, you know, the name of the document, including the server that it's going to, and then the protocol, and then a blank line. The key thing is you don't just say, get me any document. You actually tell it the host that you're looking for. And by looking at this, That's how the virtual hosting works. And so it says, oh, I'm one host really, but I can pretend to be many hosts and know which host I'm being asked for with that information. And so that's how the virtual hosting works. So when a GET request comes into a server, it can say, I have many virtual hosts inside myself, and I'll pick the right one. And so if we look at the browser's debugger console, we can see that it's asking and doing a GET request to a particular Python Anywhere URL and with a particular domain name, and the domain name is part of the request, which is what makes their virtual hosting happen. And so this is where in the web tab of Python Anywhere you've got to give this thing about where are you at, and you have to say, within this server I'm running at this home folder, and so that's your home directory, you know, Dango projects, local library, your working directory, where it's supposed to go when it receives a request for you. And then it has this one configuration file, and you'll notice that that file doesn't belong, that www.mdntutorial_pythonanywhere.com_WGSI, the WGSI configuration file is not in your data space. So that's actually in the system, and that's the place where the system can look up where you're going, and then that file, and again, if you read that file, you'll see it's telling where it's supposed to go in the overall system to start in a directory and load the configuration for a particular application, and up you go. And so this is kind of the picture of how it all works. You know, you got a browser out here, and that the browser is making many requests to this server, which is one piece of physical hardware, and then there's a little piece of software. Often it's a open source software called Nginx, and it has a whole bunch of configuration files that you put in their user interface, and it has little instances of Django, one for each of the domains in those systems. And so you're isolated from all the other ones, whether it's MDN Tutorial, pythonanywhere.com, DJ4E, pythonanywhere.com, or just some other kind of thing. It doesn't even have to be Django. It can be just about anything. And so there are these configuration files that allow, and all this really accomplishes is reusing some of the server hardware so that you don't have to have a dedicated piece of hardware for every single piece of software. And then within that is what I showed you before, and that is how the request works in your settings file. But the goal of Nginx is getting it to your front door so that your application gets the requests that are destined for it. So this is both how these applications are combined into one server using virtual hosting, but also how applications work internally. And so I just wanted to give you a really short overview of how this all works so that you can build the picture a little bit at a time over the next few weeks as you learn this material. Hello, and welcome to our lecture on owned rows in Django. So what do I mean by an owned row? Well, up to now, every CRUD application that you've written, you got a table or a model or two. Maybe they're connected, but basically if you log in, you can edit every row. And so if you do a list, you see an update and delete button on every row. Real applications don't work that way. If you're building a classified ad system, some ads belong to you and some ads belong to other people. You can see them all, but you can't edit them all. So you have to decide when to put the edit and delete buttons up, and only do those for the owner. And we got to make it so you can't like sneak in and edit and delete other people's stuff. And so we have to protect these rows from being edited or deleted by anybody but the owner, but anybody can see them. And so that's why I call them owned rows. If there's a row that you own, you will see an edit or delete button. If there's a row you don't own, you'll see the row and the data, and you'll be able to read it and view it, and that's it. And so if we go back to how we were working in our CRUD application, we were making heavy uses of these generic views, the generic list view. And so when we're all said and done, after a whole bunch of machinations, you ended up with a very, very simple view. You ended up with a horse list view that extended generic list view. Generic list view is provided to us by Django. And the only thing we had to do was take this code, which is several thousand lines of code, and inform it as to which model we want it to be, and then we make another view, right? So we make the horse list view by extending generic list view and informing that list view that we want to do this in the model with horses. And from that point on, all kinds of convention happens. And so we know things like the variable will be named horse list. It'll be a list of objects that are retrieved from the list of model objects that are retrieved from the database. And so we kind of know how that works. And it makes things really simple, not a lot of repetition. Every view kind of looks the same. You probably have done cats, dogs, autos, a couple of different things. And they all look very much the same, and if you get good at it, you should be able to make these changes very rapidly. So if we look at how this is working kind of from an object-oriented perspective, we are making a new class called gview.views.horselistView, and we are extending, our parent class is the generic list view, and we're sort of adding our own little special sauce by saying one class variable model equals horse. Okay, and so that's kind of what's going on here. Now, in this owner view, we're going to do something quite similar. And that is when we're going to have an article, and this is all from the DJ for eSamples My Arts example, we're going to extend owner list view. Now, soon we will look inside owner list view and we'll see that owner list view is extending generic list view, and this model equals article is informing owner list view. The difference is this is our code that belongs to us, and in the last part we will show you everything that you have to do to build one of these things. And so we're taking the list view, which has almost everything we want, and we're going to add one feature to it, and then we're going to extend the list view and create a new view called owner list view, or you might call it list view for owned rows. And at that point, you're good. And this class owner list view, which we'll see in a second, has everything you need to deal with rows that are owned. And for example, we're going to have a owner column. So every article is going to have an owner, and if that's equal to the current logged in user, then we are going to show these little edit and delete buttons. But if the article owner, the owner value inside the article object, or the model, if that owner is not equal to the current user, we don't show it. Now, not showing a link does not mean you've protected it from editing. We'll show you later how that protection from editing happens. But this is such a common problem that we want to just be able to, in a sense, say, look, here's a list view. Here's a list view with this special owner column in it, and we want to maintain the owner column. We don't want to have to write hundreds of lines of code in every view that we want to have this owner column. So we just use object-oriented techniques to accomplish this. And so we're going to use inheritance, and we talked about it and talk about it again. Inheritance is the idea that you have a class, you're going to make another class that inherits all that parent class and then extends it, adds a little bit of stuff to it. And it's another form of don't repeat yourself. Do something once in a parent class. You make the parent class sometimes quite generic, then you make a child class that extends the parent class, and then we use the child class. Or we could call them subclasses or child classes. There's a whole bunch of different terminology, and it's all pretty much equivalent. Subclasses are more specialized versions of a class. They inherit attributes and methods from their parent classes and can introduce their own. Again, basic object-oriented. So now we're going to take a look inside of a generic edit view, and we want to look at how it functions internally so that we can override and extend some of those functions. So we can take the generic edit view and turn it into a edit view that supports an owned row. So this is a review. We've gone back a couple of lectures. This is the edit form flow, right? And I went through this in great and gory detail, so I'll just review it really quickly, right? So you've hit the edit button, right? So you do a get request to like /1 or /15. You're going to grab that data. Oops. You're going to go in. You're going to load the primary key 1 or 2 or 15. If you didn't find it, you're going to send in 404 error, and then you're going to fill the form with old data. The user's going to edit that data. They're going to post the good data. Then the form is going to be validated, of course, according to the form rules. Remember, the model kind of deals with the back end, and the form kind of deals with the front end. So the validation is a form aspect, and then if there's an error, it goes back and allows you to redo it. And then if there's no error in the submitted data, Then we load a new model up. We reload the model, check to see if that model is accessible, and accessible is going to matter a lot to us in a second. If it's there and you can read it, and you're legally allowed to read it, great. Otherwise, we're going to give you a 404 as you're submitting the data, and that has to do with if they messed with the form or something, or they're submitting it to the wrong URL. But if we can get the data, we change the data, and we store the updated data, and then we do the success URL, right? And so that's the basic form flow. We did that before. We did that with every one of our CRUDs. And we also looked at this documentation in the generic list view. It could be in some of the edit views. At some point, you will see in the Django documentation, it's telling you how this class is functioning internally, how it's working its own magic inside itself. And this is method flowchart. First, it's going to call setup, then it's called dispatch. Check to see if the method's allowed. Get its template name, get a query set, load the data from the database, get the context object name, get the context data, and then render to response. And so you might say, why are they showing us all this? And the answer is because we can get our hands in and mess with these things. And these are like our access points into this generic list view class that allow us to dig in and make changes. And so if we were to look at that same picture and think of it from the point of view of which methods are being called at the moment where this generic edit, in this case it's going to be an edit view, this generic edit view is happening. So here we go. So the GET request comes in, it's got some primary key, so it does a GET query set, and it reads this thing, and then it reads it using GET query set. It's still reading it, but it happens to be doing it in a method called GET query set. And if GET query set works or doesn't, then it keeps on going. Then as it's rendering the template, it's going to get the context data by calling a method called GET context data. That's another place that we're going to play with, and we're going to inject ourselves into GET context data. Then we'll do the edit, the post will come in, and then it's going to do validation, but it does it in a method called form valid. So the first thing that happens upon the receipt of post is it checks to see if the form is valid. We're going to add our own little code into form valid as well. If it goes back, it does a render, so it's going to use get context data. If it is good, there's no error, then it's going to actually call get query set again to get the data, and then it's going to modify the data, and then it's going to store the data. There's some name for this, but I didn't put it in. The point is, each of these moments where there's something critical going on, form valid, get query set, that's a place where we can extend the behavior of this built-in class without knowing too much about the class. And I showed you at the end of a few lectures ago this crazy override. I did this crazy override where I made this weird equine view, and I have a model of car and a template name, and then I'm overriding get query set. So this is extending generic list view, but instead of using the get query set that's in generic list view, we're going to call our own get query set. So instead of reading car objects, we're going to read horse objects. And then we're going to return a list of them. And that's what the get query set has to do. The rule of get query set is you get called, you have to return a list. If we didn't write this code, it would do this except with car. But we did write this code. Why? Because we wanted to override it. Was there any logic to it? No, just because I wanted to show you crazy things, right? And so because I've overridden in the generic list view, it's not calling the generic list view's query set at all, which would look at the model car, but instead it's calling mine that's in wacky equine view. And so when it prints out, you see a list of horses, not a list of cars, because I overrode what behavior was inside the list view class, which normally would be informed by that, but my code in here ignored it. Again, I have no purpose for this other than showing you that I can change the behavior of the parent class while creating a derived class. Now sometimes, in this case, I'm just completely overriding it, and it's like, I don't care what you were going to do before, I'm going to do something completely different. And you have to know what the rules are. I had to know what the return. It took me a while to write this, and I might have even looked at some Django source code to figure this out. But eventually, through Stack Overflow, I figured this out. So this is not trivial to write, and I'm not expecting you to write this. I just want to show you the technique. Like this keyword args, that's something. I'm sure at some point I knew what it was, but I just stole that off of Stack Overflow like everybody does. So in this def get query set, you'll see that I have just overridden and ignored the def query set from generic list view. Okay? That's one way of overriding a method. Another way of overriding a method is this get context data. So what is get context data going to do? Well, at some level, get context data is what puts in this list ends up going into horse list, right? So that's somehow this variable that I return here in query set ends up being put into my context as horse list, so then I can write this loop that prints that stuff out. And that's by convention, right? It actually looks at the type of this thing and says, oh, that's a list of horses, so it makes up the variable and puts it in the context. Now, where that's being done in generic list view is in a method called get context data. And so I actually don't want to completely replace get context data, although I probably could if I want, because this is so simple. What I actually want to do is I want to augment the context, and I want to throw something else in it. So what I want to do is I want to run the code from generic list view first. I want to get the context back from that, and then I want to add something to it, and then return sort of like this composite context. Okay? And it's not, the syntax is a little scary, but it's okay. So let's take a look at get context data. Just like anything, self is the instance. Self is always the instance. KW-args is just a way of taking all the parameters so I can pass them in. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to say, hey, super. Super is like calling get context data in generic list view. So go into my super class. Wacky Equines view is a subclass. List view is my super class. Super, get context data, and pass whatever arguments were going in there. We're all good. So just call that. Do it. And pass in all the arguments. And do whatever. And that's what ends up putting in horse list. And so at that point, context is going to be a dictionary that has horse list in it. But then I want to put some more stuff in. So then that goes into generic list view and then comes back out of generic list view and gives me, and if all I did is return to context, then I really wouldn't have changed anything. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw in this little extra key called crazy thing and put the string crazy thing in it. And then I return all that, and then eventually it goes into the template, and this context finds its way into the template. And again, that's all inside of generic list view, and eventually horse list is there because of the call to the super, and crazy thing is there just because I explicitly put it in. And so I have augmented without replacing. The first one I completely replaced get query set. In the second one, I called the parent, and then I augmented the return value and then returned kind of the combination of what the list view did and what I want to add to the list view. So hello. With all that as lead up, we are going to finally start taking a look at how we actually build this owner list view. So let's take a look. So the basic idea is we're going to make a new class called owner list view, owner update view, owner create view, a whole series of classes that sort of mirror the generic ones, and we're going to add our own little sauce. And we are going to basically make our owner list view, which is going to extend generic list view, and we're going to extend owner list view to create article list view. So the thing we ultimately end up with as our view is sort of 3 layers deep, where we have our view that extends another one of our views that extends a view that came from Django. And so there we go. And so things like article list, HTML as the template, and all that convention, and the name of the variable article list, that's all convention. And we've been doing that quite a bit. So let's start with the models changes. Now in this model, everything except one line should be familiar to you and pretty comfortable. The only line that's a little bit different is this owner line. So it's just another field. It turns out to be an integer. It's a foreign key, like all foreign keys are integers. And on delete models cascade, you have seen that before. That simply means if we have a bunch of articles that are linked to a user and we delete that user, it deletes the 4 articles that were associated with the user in order to keep the internal pointers consistent. So that part is all the same, quite comfortable, and you've been doing that for a while. Now, settings, auth user model. We're importing settings from Django, and we are making a foreign key to a model that is not ours. It is something that Django maintains. Django always has a user model somewhere. It may be named one thing or a different thing. We just don't know. We don't know what the name of the user model is, and so we have to ask Django for it, and Django conveniently always leaves it in this location, settings.auth user model. And it turns out if you want to change it, you got to change that variable. But for us, we're not going to change where it's at. Django's going to set it for us, and we're just going to use it. So there's 2 tables. There's this article table and some user table somewhere, and there's a foreign key relationship between them in a database level. And once you make this database, you could go see what the name of that table is, because it will show you the create statement that it actually used. Not that that matters. And so it's pretty much a normal old thing like we've been making, except it's got this extra owner column. And that's what that's the thing we're focusing on right now. Okay, so the views are going to be pretty straightforward. The thing you're going to see about the views is we're not going to use the generic list view, the generic detail, the generic blah, blah, blah. We're going to make our own. These are made by us, myarts.owner. So we'll see owner.py in a second. And so article list view, which is we got a urls.py that routes here, is going to extend owner list view and say, do this model. Things like the template name and everything, that's all done by convention, right? So we're going to have a detail view, a create view. Now the one thing that's different about the create and update is there are 2 things. There's a form, which tells what shows up on the screen, and then there is the model back here that shows up what ends up in the database, right? So the model, article model, is what's in the database. The form is what we show on the screen. So the model is which model is in the database, and fields are which model fields are to be put on the screen. We're not going to show all of the fields on the screen. In particular, we are not putting the owner field in, because we're not letting the user say this is owned by number 12. If it's owner 12, great. That number 12 is the current logged in user. It's not something we let the user see. So we don't put owner in here. We put the title in the text. We don't put updated at or created at, all the things from the model. We have to tell that we want this to put in the form and that to put in the form. This is going to be handled internally, and all these 3 are going to be handled internally. Owner, created at, and updated at are handled internally. Text and title are to be shown to the user. And so here we are in article create view, and we're saying this is the model, and make a form based on that model, but only for two of the fields. Ignore the other fields. The same for an update, and then the delete, it doesn't use an actual form, so you just tell it which model it's going to use. So again, this is a triumph of don't repeat yourself. All the brains of this operation are really add an owner column, add an owner column, and then extend these classes that we are about to make. Extend the classes that we're about to make. Now I want to show you how to make the classes. So I show you the easy stuff. Now we talk about the hard stuff. Okay. So this is the owner update view. And so let's take a quick review of the owner update view. And when we first do a GET request, if we go look at the documentation, it says, oh, I want to show you the old data in a form, and I'm going to call a function called getQuerySet in generic update view. Okay? And if I can't get anything, if I don't get anything, I'll give you an error. So this is like to a URL like /edit/2. And if the 2 is not in the database, then you're going to get a 404. So we call getQuerySet. Okay? And so let's just take a look at getQuerySet. So the way we're going to do this is, because we're in the middle of an update, the user is intending to modify it, which means we're not going to let them modify it unless they're the actual owner. So what we're going to do is we are going to override the query set. And I just put a print statement in for yucks. And so the first thing we're going to do is get the default query set. This is going to pick the model that we're going to query, and it's probably going to say something like, you know, the primary key is whatever that number was, 2 or 14. And so we're going to actually get a query set back. And so that says, super, go into owner update view, owner update, go into, no, not owner update view, go into update view, and go run its query set, and then give me back that query set. And then what I'm going to do after I got that query set is add a AND clause to filter it that says, okay, whatever that primary key was, fine. And the owner column of this model must match the current logged in user. And so it's like I'm adding a where clause and an and to the where clause. The other thing that you'll notice here is login required mixin. I could have put login required mixin on all those in the views.py, but I need to have this variable self request user properly defined, which means any owner update view, you really can't use it unless you're logged in. So it's like I'm going to put the login required mixin here. That's like a marker interface that says, look, if you're not logged in, send them to log in and then come back here. And if they can't log in, I'm never going to let them run this code. Because if you let a non-logged in user run this code, it would blow up right there. So in a sense, this is like a guardian pattern to say, don't even bother coming in here if you're not properly logged in and you don't have a user object properly passed in as request.user. And so that's why I put login required mixin there. So the key here is we're going to do a where clause that is where ID equals 7 and owner equals 14, whatever the current logged in user is. And so that means that when you come in here, if you're trying to edit a thing, you're going to get a 404, right? If it doesn't exist, you're going to get a 404, or if you don't own it, you're going to get a 404. 404 is not found, and it's legit to say it might be there, but you didn't find it because you were trying to read it for updating. So by changing the query set, in a sense, to return 0 records when you don't own the record, because this is an update view. If you look at the list view, it doesn't do any tricky stuff because you can list them all, right? And so a list view is no big deal, a detail view is no big deal, but an update or a delete view, yeah, detail view and list view are good, but an update and a delete, you have an intention of modifying it, so we're not even going to let you retrieve the record if you don't own it. So we do that by overriding the query set, calling super, and then augmenting the query set when we get it back so that it accomplishes what we want to achieve. So the next thing we're going to look at is how we actually store the data. And the storing of the data is in form valid. We're going to override form valid. And what form, remember when the post data comes in, we're going to, it first calls form valid. That checks to see if the things are the right length, if it's a date, it's the right format. Who knows what it does, but we're also going to override it and stick our own code in form valid. So yes, it's going to do all those checks, but also we're going to do a little sneaky thing to make what we want to do that's going to solve the create and update situation, but it's mostly for the create. And so in the create view, it sends out a blank form, and then in comes the data, but we never showed owner. Let's go back a little bit, right? So if we're going create view, the form that we're going to send out is title and text. There is no owner field. Now this owner is required, and so we have to get the owner in. So what we do here, it's really quite simple. We're going to, so there's a form object, which is kind of like the UI side of things, and then there's a model object. And so form.save commit equals false says just copy the data into an object as if we were going to store it, but don't actually store it. Commit equals false is make it, but don't store it. And then we're going to add the owner field, which is there, to be self-request user. Now self-request user, remember, is like 16. It's some number. It's the primary key of the user. And so that's going to copy 16 in here. And then we're going to save it. But then we're also going to do the validation and call the super to do form validation for us. And so we're calling the create view form validation as well to make sure everything else is done properly. Okay? Okay, so when it's all said and done, all we have to do to make an owner work in this situation is we add an owner column, foreign key to the right place, we import owner delete view, and then we just extend owner delete view to make article delete view, and then tell it which model to work in, and then the magic all happens. So I'm not going to show you owner delete view, just you know that it's going to force login, and it's going to only let you delete rows that you own in the system.